Welcome, dear learner and friend, to this lecture where I will be talking to you about what I have called the developments in Elizabethan poetry, developments in poetry, where we are specifically talking about the Elizabethan sonnet and the lyric. Now, to talk of the Elizabethan period in terms of poetry is basically to be talking about one of the earliest and richest periods of poetic output in English literature. And you have before you on your screens two such specimens taken from Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. But obviously, a Spenser or a Shakespeare do not just come out of the blue. So what we'll do here is very briefly understand what is the development that we are basically talking about. That is, when Elizabethan poetry is heralded as the zenith of English poetry, what has led to that? How has the evolution been? And in course of that, I presuppose you have some knowledge of Old and Middle English poetry, which we will quickly run through, moving onwards to how the Renaissance, which as it has impacted all aspects of European cultural life, how it has come to have its bearings on English poetry, on Elizabethan poetry. So, to quickly talk of the Old and Middle English periods, where you will find that poetry of these periods can somehow be categorized into certain specific divisions. Like when we are talking of Old English, the first thing that comes to your mind obviously is Old English heroic poetry, where you talk of Beowulf. You have elegiac poetry, the nature of which is mostly to be found in a monologic and a meditative form. And of course, there is the religious poetry, where you have those blend of pre-Christian elements with Christian ideas, Christian thoughts. The reason behind this, obviously, is that the entire corpus of Old English literature basically existed in an oral form. And it was only after the arrival of the Christian missionaries and the beginnings of the gradual Christianization of England that this oral literature came to be gradually written down in the monasteries. So in terms of Old English poetry, that is poetry as it exists with us, what we have basically is a blend of Christian and pre-Christian elements. Many would prefer to use the term pagan. I would not, because it is rather more technically correct to talk of it as Christian elements getting infused into pre-Christian poetry, which was an expression of the ways and forms of life. Now then come to Middle English. You have the verse chronicles that are written as history, but are at best romantic in a rather codified sense, I would say. Codified because the insistence on courtly customs, on chivalry, on a cultured presentation reigns supreme. So, when you talk of romantic poetry in the present sense, and when you talk of romantic poetry in the Middle English understanding of it, they become very different. Then you have religious poetry, which is once again of a very didactic nature. The metrical romances, you will be knowing of the 4 different kinds of matter into which metrical romances are generally classified, where again the insistence is on either French folk tales, Latin stories, and of course English folk. And finally, of course, you have Chaucer, with whom we have what can be called the beginnings of modernity in the Middle English period. Now then comes the poetry from Chaucer to Spenser. Spenser is somebody whom we will be taking up in this discussion at some length. But then how does one bridge the poetry that comes between Chaucer and Spenser? And if I were to quote the very seminal historian of English literature, Edward Albert, he says that no English poet of any consequence, if we do not talk of the Scottish poets of the age, that is, this intervening period. We are talking of poets like William Dunbar. Now, these Scottish poets also more or less continued the Chaucerian flavor, but of course, they did not have the elegance of a Chaucer. An important name in this context is John Skelton, whose doggerel verse has come to be known as Skeltonics. But yes, of course, there is one genre in this period which is of interest in later Elizabethan poetry, that is the beginnings of the eclogue. What is an eclogue? An eclogue is basically a short poem, and most often the subject of eclogues are conversations between shepherds. So it is clearly a pastoral mode that is appearing on the scene, where the Middle English technique of the allegory remains a device. And you will find a follow-up of this in Spenser's mature poetry also. That is why the understanding of the eclogue is important. But on the whole, when we are talking of the period between Chaucer and Spenser, we are actually talking of a sense of decadence in poetry. Now then comes our discussion of why is the Renaissance an important literary influence. You have elsewhere in this course heard about the Renaissance in much detail. What I will be talking about here basically is how the Renaissance as a literary cultural movement came to affect English poetry. And so I have before you here a very clear categorical division as to what was derived from native poetic traditions and what are the gifts of the Renaissance. There are, first of all, a redefinition of the lyrical elements, the lyrical qualities that we find in varying degrees in both Old English and Middle English. Then there are the romances that are, as I just said, of a very codified heroic nature. Chivalry is supreme, and of course there is the insistence on the meter. That's why it has come to be called as the metrical romance. I just spoke of the eclogues. Therefore, the pastoral poetry, the rudimentary form, is something that the native tradition had. And finally, of course, as you have poems like Ormulum in the Middle English period, there are the religious and moralistic poems which are more of a didactic intent. I'm not saying that none of this was carried down into the Renaissance and post-Renaissance. But what I'm trying to understand and discuss with you is how these native elements blend with, fuse with the gifts of the Renaissance. And what are they? What are the gifts? First and foremost, and you will have heard this over and over again, yet at the cost of repetition, its value does not diminish. A reflection of the cultural and intellectual ecosystem, definitely caused by the revival of classical learning, not just the revival, but also the availability of classical learning in European vernaculars. And with it, naturally, when we are talking of a cultural and intellectual ecosystem, how do we understand the manifestation of this? Once again, a very oft heard term, that is the rise of humanist interest. Now, I have classified for your understanding the very broad term humanist interest into several categories. One, we talk of scholarliness. Second, we talk of stylistic flourish. And third, we talk of ethical concerns. Now, as we proceed further into the poetry of this period, you will understand how the ethical concerns that are a result of humanism are rather different from the religious, moralistic, didactic intent of the native English traditions. Next, and once again very important, something that you find suffused in Middle English. You will not find a lot of this in Old English. I am talking of the idea of the prevalence of divinity in poetry. Why don't you find much of it in Old English? The reason is simple. As I just said, we are talking of a pre-Christian time where definitely, say you talk of Beowulf, you don't have a Christian god in Beowulf. What do you have? You have the insistence on fate, weird, W-Y-R-D. And when you come to Middle English, what do you have? You have the predominance of the church that suffuses literary output in general, poetic output in particular. Once again, the significant difference in this is what you find in the poetry of Chaucer. If you have, for example, read Chaucer's introduction, that is Chaucer's prologue, where he talks about, among other characters, also liturgical, liturgy means church, where he talks about church characters like the prioress or the monk, you will see how Chaucer actually manages to, with a very innocent plain face, he is not critical, he is never satirical, but in a very intelligent manner, he brings out from within his liturgical characters the humanist element, the human in them. And that is one reason why Chaucer is often considered the father of English poetry. Now, what Chaucer was doing by hints and suggestions becomes the norm in Renaissance, because the theocentric or the God-centric universe comes to be replaced by interest in man. And M here is capitalized deliberately, because the Renaissance believes that human beings are a potential, they are an infinite reservoir of possibilities. And it is not that the divine origin of man alone matters to the Renaissance. The Renaissance learns to inculcate the value of human worth. Not just human worth, also the value of human life and human values. And finally, I have mentioned, once again, something that you know if you are acquainted with European history of this period. This was also an era of geographical explorations. The world was being circumnavigated. New lands were being discovered. References to it abound in poetry. And it is not just new lands that were being discovered, that was also being supplemented by intellectual explorations. Now, how do all of these translate into what I have called the Renaissance as an enabling factor? We have categorized it into 4 different subsections for your better and easier understanding. The first, as I have mentioned, is political patronage. This is the first period in the history of England and also of English literature where we find the concept of court poets being nurtured and patronized. As you will see, a lot of the poets whom you study under Elizabethan poetry were basically courtiers or diplomats. In other words, the royal court became a center that provided for the flourish of the arts and the cultures. Second, I've talked of cultural exchange. Now, what do I mean by cultural exchange? If you look at the map of Europe and if you study the direction, the evolutionary direction in which the impact of the Renaissance gradually reached English shores, you will find that It has earlier traveled through lands like Italy and Spain and France before reaching England. So what effectively happens is that English literature comes to receive the most mature output of the Renaissance, where there is a very majestic, I would say, blend of classical learning tempered with continental understanding. In that sense, therefore, Renaissance and post-Renaissance literature in England shows this element of cultural exchange. I already mentioned the importance of humanism or the insistence on man. Now, how does this translate when we read poetry of the period? You will, and this is not just for poetry, you will also hear it elsewhere in the context of drama and prose literature. But in poetry in particular, you will be amazed at the manner in which the individual subject, the human being, and this human being, let me tell you, is not always a royal personage. There are the peasants, there are the courtiers, there are the common men. All of them, for the first time, become the subject of poetry. And finally, poetry also serves the purpose of political and social commentary, as you will see. That is, just because there were court poets doesn't mean that they were always singing paeans or praises to the king or the queen, whether it be James I or whether it be Queen Elizabeth. They were also one of the most trenchant critics of policies, just as they were also upholders of nationalism that was newly fledged. Now, with this bit of a cultural background, we move to a quick understanding of what exactly is the sonnet as a literary form. First and foremost, as you see on your screens, the term itself is derived from Italian, sonetto, sonetto, which means a little song or a little sound. So by its very etymology, the sonnet is suffused with lyrical and musical qualities, which is why you understand I have titled this lecture Sonnets and Lyrics. It is not to say that sonnet is one kind of a poetry and lyric is another kind of a poetry. What we are basically talking of here is the suffusion of lyrical elements in the Elizabethan sonnet, in the post-Renaissance sonnet, which, as I have by now mentioned to you, was definitely a gift of the Renaissance. So it was developed in the 13th century with significant contributions from Italian experts, Italian scholars, obviously, perfected by Petrarch, of course. Francesca Petrarch is considered to be the originator of the sonnet form as it came into England. Therefore, why is Petrarch considered important? Petrarch is considered important because it is not that Petrarch is the originator of the sonnet. Please get it right. The sonnet in its rudimentary form already existed thanks to significant contributions by Giacomo da Lentini. Petrarch actually further perfected it. And it is this form, this perfected form, that reached English shores. Now you have before you here on your screens an example of a Petrarchan sonnet, where I have also shown for you the rhyme scheme that I mentioned in the earlier slide. Therefore, this is how a Petrarchan sonnet stands. But notice very significantly the variation in the rhyme scheme of the sestet. Now, a sonnet, you know by now definitely, is generally divided into two sections. A sonnet is a 14-line poem. It's divided into two sections generally. The first 8 known as the octave and the next 6 known as the sestet. And as we proceed, you will find that within this 14-line structure that was initially divided into an octave and a sestet, how the Elizabethan poets experiment not just with form, but also how they blend their experiments with form along with the presentation of their subject. Now, to talk of the sonnet in England, the first two names that will come obviously are Sir Thomas Wyatt and Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey. Wyatt it was who is credited with having first attempted his hand at writing a sonnet, initially beginning with translations of Petrarch and then gradually adapting the Petrarchan form. Now, there is one thing here that we need to understand. In this period of the history of literature that we are talking about, the sonnet is a new form, yet to be domesticated. So, while you go through this lecture, you also have to keep in mind how and in what forms, in what ways this domestication of a continental form, of an Italian form, into English gradually happens. So, to that extent, Wyatt and his immediate junior, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, are poets who must be credited with the first writing of the sonnet in English. And their poems, along with poems by several other poets, also as you see here, was published as Tottel's Miscellany. It had a long name, songs and sonnets, so on and so forth, but colloquially, conventionally understood as Tottel's Miscellany, which came in the year 1557. Now, why do Wyatt and Surrey matter? One, because as I just said, Wyatt introduces the sonnet form, translates it, adapts it. Petrarch follows suit. And Petrarch has been considered the better craftsman than Wyatt. Well, it's difficult to make such distinctions, but then literary scholars generally consider Petrarch to be the better craftsman, and for all the right reasons, as we shall shortly see. Next, their experiments with metrical form, that is, the manner in which Wyatt in particular tried to punctuate the 10-syllabled iambic line with shorter line stanzas. That at times does give a jerking effect, a jolting effect, no doubt. But then he does it, and he does it in an eventual manner so that gradually we come to also accept the experiments with. Third, and very important, they were importing the convention of heterosexual love. That is, lover-beloved relationships almost directly from Petrarch's form. And if you read some of the early sonnets, whether Italian or English, you will find that in most of them, the stock theme is the relationship between the beloved and the lover. And in most cases, the lover is a supplicant, praying for love, and the beloved seems to be having all the privileges of granting or not granting. And finally, they matter also because both from a literary, a critical, and a craftsman's perspective, as David Deisha says, he calls it a perfectly tuned instrument. Now you have before you here two poems by Wyatt and Surrey, which I would obviously ask you to pause and read for yourselves so that you understand. It's not just enough that we theorize, it's also important that we relate what we are saying to the text as such. And I have marked out both poems in different colors to show where the stanza break occurs. For example, if you look at the poem by Wyatt, and I'm not going to read it out for you, you will see that the octave is the complete unit. The sestet is broken up. That is, there are first the 4 lines beginning with the body dead, the sprite had his desire, and so on. And finally, there is the couplet. So you have to think for yourselves what impact this makes when, say, you compare a poem in this manner, a sonnet written in this form, with the one by Petrarch that you just came across earlier. How do these experiments with form also impact the content, the thought? These are things that you have to pause and think for yourself. And that is basically what I have put here as some kind of a learner activity that would help you to be both a recap of what we have so long spoken, as also to go ahead and witness for yourselves the maturing and the development of the sonnet form in England. So having spoken about Wyatt and Surrey, the next point on the cards obviously is, you remember the first slide that I had shown you, where I had mentioned Spenser. And we are here talking of Edmund Spenser, who has famously been called the poet's poet by the romantic critic Charles Lamb. One, the Shepherd's Calendar, which is in the form of an eclogue, as I mentioned earlier. And the other, obviously, is the Fairy Queen, Spenser's magnum opus. Initially planned in 12 books, he managed to write only 6. The first 3 of these were published in 1589. The other 3 and some fragments of the 7th came in 1596. Now, between these 2 poems, you will actually see the range of Spenser. On the one hand, the Shepherd's Calendar is in the form of a pastoral, an eclogue, where he is delineating peasant life in a year-long activity. The other, the Fairy Queen, is much more heavy in subject, in tone, whereas I have shown here, he talks of politics, he talks of nationalism, which was a newfound concept, he talks of a moral allegory, and most importantly, there is the presentation of Queen Elizabeth as Gloriana, obviously the central character of the Fairy Queen. Now quickly, the Spenserian sonnet. How does that work? First of all, and you have on your screens a poem. Once again, I won't read it out, it is for you to see. But I'll just highlight the major points as you read through the poem. 1. Notice how Spenser, with adroitness and much more ease compared to Wyatt, adapts and innovates on the Italian model to suit the English tongue. 1. Second, notice his deviations with the rhyme scheme. You no longer have just the octave sestet. He's breaking it up into so many sections, so many fragments. Why? How does it help him? 1, obviously because he can get past the rigidity of the Italianate form, the octave sestet form, which had by now begun to appear somewhat kind of a stilted. But more importantly, if you peruse the concluding part of the sonnet, that is those lines, my verse your virtues rare shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name. What is he talking about? He's not talking just about love. He's not talking just about the beloved. He is talking about the power of poetry to immortalize. So this is a paradigm shift that you notice, and a shift that has later been exploited to the hilt by Shakespeare. Once we are done with Spenser, we will briefly talk about Sir Philip Sidney, and I have very deliberately called him the poet theorist. I'll come to the theorist part in a while. The poet in Sidney needs to be understood. Once again, you have on your screens a text, one of Sydney's most famous and most anthologized poems, Loving in Truth, which is the opening sonnet of his immortal sonnet sequence, Astrophel and Stella. You have on your screens also the basic information about Astrophel and Stella, that is a collection of some 108 love sonnets along with other songs. What I want you to notice here is Sydney's arrangement of thought, which I would say perhaps goes even one step ahead than what we saw in Spencer. What is Sydney doing here? If you notice, the basic theme remains the same. That is man-woman or lover-beloved relationships where the lover is a supplicant. The lover has an apology to offer. But notice how, for the first time, the advent of logical arrangement of thought comes into poetry. Look at the very stage-wise, almost mathematical structure in which Sydney arranges his thought. Loving in truth and fain in words my love to show. That's fine. Why? Why would he show his love? That she, dear she, that is the beloved, might take some pleasure of my pain. Why? What would happen if she takes pleasure? Pleasure, by the way, is not to be understood the way we understand the word in its modern sense. Here, pleasure would mean taking note of, taking cognizance of. So, what would happen if the beloved takes cognizance? Pleasure might cause her read. Read what? This poem, such poetry, poetry of love. And why? What would reading do? Reading might make her know. Therefore, look at the circumlocutory manner in which ultimately a note of love, a proposal is being put forth. So even in that, you might notice, obviously, a hint of a satiric mode being used. But more importantly, what matters here is Sydney's use of images. Notice the images that he is using. Oft turning others' leaves, lines by other poets, to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. This should be activity for you. Understanding Sydney's use of images, Sydney's use of metaphors. And once again, if you come to the sestet, you will find that there is the same movement from poetry of love, to the poet's ability to eternalize. And most importantly, and important because we are also going to talk of Sydney as a theorist. Important because the last line of the poem, if you notice, talks of something very important in the context of English poetry. The need for originality. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write. Do not blindly follow others' lines. Do not ape from others. Write your own lines. Now, Sydney as a critic or a theorist. Sydney's apology for poetry, as I have said, is an amalgamation, like much of Renaissance poetry, like much of Elizabethan poetry, of the entire oeuvre of classical learning mediated through continental influences. And if I were to utter one sentence that categorizes Sydney's approach to poetry, Sydney's understanding of poetry, and thereby Sydney's assimilation of classical learning, classical thought, with that of Elizabethan understanding, that is, as I have put it here on the slide, Sydney's famous words where he talks of the ability of poetry to transcend reality, Her, that is nature's world, the real world, is brazen. The poets only deliver a golden. So in this, as I have shown in this slide, you will see if you read through it, Sidney is bringing in Plato, Sidney is bringing in Aristotle, he is even talking of the Roman scholar and theoretician Horace. Very important. Horace first gave us the idea of the dual functions of literature. What are the dual functions? To edify and to gratify. That is to teach and to give pleasure. So all of it comes into Sidney's understanding of poetry, which in turn is reflected in Sidney's own poetic output. Now here you have on your screens a very quick look at some of the other poets who also matter when we are talking in the context of Elizabethan sonnets and lyrics. Of them, obviously, Christopher Marlowe remains a must-read because of the sheer power that he invests into poetry. You will definitely read more about Marlowe, hear more about Marlowe in his plays, in the context of his plays. But here, what is important is the Renaissance aspect of virtu, or strength, power, ability, virtuosity, all of it put together, is what characterizes the poetry of Christopher Marlowe. And here we obviously are talking of the maturation of the Elizabethan sonnet and the lyric, which, having passed through the hands of Marlowe, finally comes to Shakespeare. I will not dwell a lot on Shakespeare in this lecture, but just to bring to your notice the basic points, the major points. One, we need to remember that Shakespeare would not have been Shakespeare had it not been for the maturing influences that preceded him. This is true as much of Shakespearean drama as it is true of Shakespearean poetry. So his experiments, not just with form but also with content, are possible only because of the fairly long tradition that has already preceded. It is Shakespeare who further breaks up the 14 lines into 3 quatrains and a couplet. Sometimes the quatrains have an incremental pattern where they lead up to a climactic conclusion. Sometimes they have a dramatic pattern where they are in contradiction with each other, where they are in mutual opposition with each other. And finally, what happens is the couplet takes you to a denouement. Now, I am aware of other Shakespearean sonnets that are there on your syllabus, but this is one Shakespearean sonnet that I would urge all of you to read and enjoy, where the title of the slide is also a question that I have always had to myself as a student of literature. Is he witty? Is he naughty? Or is he, in some senses, the first post-colonial writer who is talking not of the fair white mistress that his predecessors have spoken of in their poetry, but the mistress, the woman in the Shakespearean sonnet, is a dark lady. Elsewhere, he also describes this dark lady as wanton, yet he says she's irresistibly desirable. So what I want you to understand as you read sonnet 130 is the fact that it is not possible for the sonnet to achieve this height, this level of maturity, this ability to risk traditions and conventions in the hands of Shakespeare, had it not been for the poetry that has preceded. Now, I will not say these are questions as such that you need to answer, but then this is both a summing up and also a discussion of what you could take away as thought, as questions from this lesson on the Elizabethan sonnet and lyric poetry, and of course a brief reference for you to look up if you feel like. Thank you.